My name is Richard Cooper, and I've been a ranger at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 15 years now. Some people say I have a special gift. I can sense things others can't. Maybe that's why I was the first to notice something wasn't right about the mist that rolled in that spring morning in 1987. You see, we get fog in the mountains all the time. That's normal. But this was different. I remember standing on my cabin porch that morning, coffee cup in hand, watching it creep through the valleys like a living thing. It was thicker than usual, almost pure white, and it moved against the wind. That's not natural, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I radioed Janet, who was working at the visitor center that morning. "You seeing this fog?" I asked. "Sure am, Rich," she replied. "We've already got 3 hikers in here saying weird things about it." "What kind of weird things?" There was a pause before she answered. "They're saying they saw themselves in it, like their own reflections, but walking around." I figured they were just spooked by regular shadows, but they all said the same thing, and they came in separately. I felt my stomach tighten. In all my years as a ranger, I'd learned to trust my gut when something felt wrong. And everything about this situation felt wrong. "I am going to check it out," I told her. "Radio if anyone else comes in with strange stories." I grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio, first aid kit, the usual stuff, and headed down toward Cades Cove, where the mist seemed thickest. The temperature dropped the closer I got to it, much colder than it should have been for a spring morning. My breath came out in white puffs, like it does in winter. The mist swirled around my boots as I walked into it. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead, but what really got to me was the silence. Usually, our forests are full of sound, birds, insects, wind in the trees. But in here, nothing. Like someone had pushed the mute button on the whole world. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was another hiker in the distance, just a dark shape in the mist. But as I got closer, my blood ran cold. It was me. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light, but another me, standing there, wearing the same ranger uniform, looking right back at me with my own eyes. And then it smiled. A smile I had never made in my life. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The other me didn't move, but its eyes followed me. I've dealt with bears, angry moose, and lost hikers in thunderstorms, but nothing had ever scared me like this. My radio crackled, making me jump. "Rich, you there?" It was Janet again, her voice shaky. "I am here," I whispered, not taking my eyes off my double. "What's wrong?" "We just got a call from Tom at the East Station. He says he's looking at himself sitting at his desk, but he's standing outside." "Rich, what's happening?" Before I could answer, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Footsteps in the mist, coming from all directions. More shapes appeared in the white fog. Some looked like hikers, others like rangers I knew, but they moved wrong, like they were learning how to walk for the first time. I clicked my radio again. "Janet, listen carefully. Tell everyone to stay out of the mist. Don't go near it, don't touch it. I am coming back." But when I turned around, I couldn't tell which way I'd come from. The mist had grown thicker, and now it seemed to glow from within. That's when I noticed something even stranger. My watch was running backward. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around and saw Mark Wilson, one of our senior rangers, standing there. Relief flooded through me until he spoke. "Hello, Richard Cooper," he said, but his voice wasn't right. It sounded like 3 people talking at once. "We've been watching you for a very long time." I reached for my flashlight, the only weapon I had. "What are you?" Mark's face rippled like water, and for a second, I saw something else beneath his skin. Something that had never been human. "We are the Mist Walkers," he said, "and we've come to stay." I ran. I am not ashamed to admit it. When something impossible is happening, sometimes running is the smartest thing you can do. I picked a direction and sprinted, my boots splashing through puddles of mist. Behind me, I heard them following not just Mark, but others too. Their footsteps didn't sound right, like they were learning how to run by copying me. The mist started to thin, and suddenly I burst out into clear air. The visitor center was ahead of me, its wooden walls a welcome sight. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. Janet was at her desk, her face pale. "Rich, thank goodness. 5 more hikers are missing. They went out this morning and never came back." And Tom called again. He says there are 2 of him now. I caught my breath and told her what I'd seen. As I spoke, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a small patch of mist seeping under the door. "We need to evacuate the park," I said. "Right now. Call everyone you can reach. Tell them to stay in their cars, don't stop for anything, and drive straight out. The mist here is something in it. Something that can copy us." Janet grabbed the phone, but it was dead. No dial tone. I tried my radio, nothing but static. Even our backup systems were down. We were cut off. That's when we heard knocking at the door. It was gentle, polite even. A voice called out, my voice. "Richard, Janet, please let us in. We just want to understand you better." Through the window, I could see them, at least 20 people standing in the mist. But something was wrong with all of them. Some had features that didn't quite match, like copies made by a printer running out of ink. Others moved in perfect unison, like they shared one mind. "The back door," I whispered to Janet, "quick and quiet." We slipped out the rear entrance of the visitor center. The mist was spreading, but there were still clear patches. We could see the parking lot where my truck was waiting. "What do they want?" Janet asked as we hurried between the trees. "I don't know," I said. "But this isn't the first time they've been here. Remember last month when I found that old journal in the ranger station? The one from 1875? It talked about something like this happening before. The mist came, people disappeared, and then it all just went away, like it never happened." We reached my truck, but Janet stopped suddenly. "Rich," she said, her voice shaking, "look at your watch." I glanced down. The hands were spinning wildly now, sometimes forward, sometimes backward. And in the distance, I saw something that shouldn't be possible. The sun was rising in the west. "Get in the truck," I told Janet. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. Not even a click. It was like all the power had been drained from the battery. That's when we saw them coming out of the mist, our fellow rangers. Tom, Mark, Sarah, and others. But these weren't the real ones. They walked too stiffly, their faces blank like masks. Behind them, the mist swirled and twisted into shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. "The storage shed," I whispered to Janet. "I have an old radio there, the kind that doesn't need electricity. Maybe we can call for help." We ran. The fake rangers didn't chase us. They just watched and smiled those wrong smiles. They knew something we didn't. Inside the shed, while Janet kept watch, I found the radio and started turning the dial. Through the static, I heard voices, hundreds of them, all talking at once. Some were from today, some from years ago, some from times that hadn't happened yet. The mist wasn't just copying people, it was breaking down time itself. "Rich," Janet's voice cracked, "you need to see this." I joined her at the window. The mist had changed color. It wasn't white anymore. It had turned slightly purple, and there were doors in it. Not real doors with wood and hinges, but holes in the air. Through them, I could see other places. Forests that weren't ours. Mountains that didn't exist. And worst of all, other versions of our park, where things had gone very, very wrong. "I found these in the corner," Janet said, holding up some old papers. They were yellow with age, the handwriting faded. "They're from 1875. Listen to this. The creatures emerge from tears in the world. They learn by copying, but they cannot copy the soul. When they take someone, the body remains, preserved in the mist like a photograph of what was." A chill ran down my spine. "Janet, where are the bodies of the missing hikers?" The answer came from behind us, a voice that sounded like Janet's, but wasn't. "Would you like to see them?" We turned around slowly. Another Janet stood there, but her feet didn't quite touch the ground. Through her body, I could see the wall behind her, like she was made of purple-tinted glass. "You are not really copying us, are you?" I asked, stepping in front of the real Janet. "You are replacing us." The fake Janet smiled. We need to understand your world. The only way to do that is to become you, all of you. Your bodies help us learn. They tell us how to move, how to speak, how to be human. The door of the shed swung open by itself. The mist poured in, and in the mist, I saw them, floating like they were underwater. The missing hikers, the rangers who had disappeared, all perfectly preserved. Their faces were peaceful, like they were sleeping, but they weren't breathing. Rich, the real Janet, grabbed my arm. Look at their watches. Every watch on every body showed the same time, 3:33. But that wasn't the strangest part. The second hands were still ticking. Time doesn't work the same way for us, the fake Janet said. Past, present, future, they're all the same. We can move between them like you move between rooms in a house. And now we want to make your world part of ours. Through the purple mist, I could see more of those holes in the air, doorways to other times, other places. In one, I saw the park as it was 100 years ago. In another, I saw it covered in strange buildings that seemed to be made of light. No, I said firmly. This is our world. You can't have it. The fake Janet's smile faded. You don't have a choice. We're already here. We've always been here. And soon, we'll be all that's left. That's when I heard engines in the distance. Lots of them. Through the window, I saw a line of black vehicles coming up the park road. Men in dark suits were getting out, carrying strange equipment. The government, fake Janet said, and for the first time, I heard fear in her voice. They've known about us since 1875. They've been waiting for us to return. I looked at the real Janet and saw in her eyes what I was thinking. This was our chance. Whatever these government people knew, whatever they were planning to do, it had the creatures scared. But before we could move, the fake Janet's body began to split, like a cell dividing under a microscope. In seconds, there were 4 of her, then 8. And they all started walking toward us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Janet's hand. We burst through the back door of the shed and into the purple mist. The copied Janets followed, their footsteps making no sound on the wet ground. The government vehicles were getting closer, their headlights cutting through the mist like knives. I could hear helicopters now too, somewhere above us. "Richard Cooper!" a voice boomed through a megaphone. "We're here to help! Stay where you are!" But I couldn't tell which direction the voice was coming from. The mist was playing tricks. Sometimes the vehicles seemed far away. Sometimes they felt like they were right next to us. And with each step we took, things got stranger. I saw myself walking beside me, but it was me from 10 years ago, when I first started as a ranger. Then another me appeared, older, with gray hair. Past, present, and future were all mixing together. The journal. Janet suddenly stopped. "Rich, remember what it said? They can't copy souls. They can only copy what they see." She was right. These creatures were like mirrors. They could only reflect what was in front of them. They didn't understand who we really were inside. The copies of Janet surrounded us, but now I noticed something I hadn't before. They all moved exactly the same way, like dancers following the same steps. They couldn't think for themselves. A man in a black suit appeared through the mist. He was carrying what looked like a giant flashlight made of silver metal. "Mr. Cooper," he said, "we've been tracking these creatures for over a century. They come through weak spots between worlds. They've tried to invade before, but we've always stopped them. The problem is," he looked at his watch, which was spinning just like mine. "They're getting better at it. They're learning." "How do we stop them?" I asked. "We don't," he said. "You do. You are sensitive to them. You can sense things others can't. That's why they're so interested in you. And that's why you are the only one who can enter their world and close the door they've opened." The fake Janets were getting closer. Through the holes in the air, I could see more creatures coming, some looking like people, others not even trying to hide what they really were. "If I go into their world," I said, "how do I get back?" The man handed me the silver device. "You'll need to find the original door, the first one they made. But be careful. In their world, all times exist at once. You'll meet other versions of yourself. Some will try to help you. Others," he paused, "won't be on your side. I looked at Janet, the real Janet, and squeezed her hand. "Keep the others safe. I'll be back." Then I stepped through one of the purple doorways in the mist. The world changed instantly. I was still in the park, but everything was wrong. The trees grew sideways. The sky was full of swirling colors I didn't have names for, and there were doors everywhere floating in the air, standing on nothing. "Welcome, Richard." I turned to find myself looking at me, but this version was different. His ranger uniform was older, from the 1800s. Next to him stood another me, wearing clothes that looked like they were made of light. "We've been waiting," the old-time me said. "Some of us want to help, others want to join them." He pointed to a group of other Richards walking toward us. Their eyes glowed purple like the mist. "W here is the first door?" I asked, gripping the silver device tightly. "Follow the memories," the future me said. As he spoke, images floated through the air like leaves in the wind. Fragments of every ranger's memories of the park. Every happy hiker, every rescued climber, every peaceful sunset. I started walking, trying to ignore the weird way the ground rippled under my feet. The infected versions of me followed, their footsteps echoing wrong, like they were walking on metal instead of earth. Then I saw it, a door that looked older than the others. It was barely visible, like a crack in the air, glowing with a faint purple light. But when I moved toward it, my other selves attacked. They came at me from all directions, past, present, and future versions of myself. But they made one mistake. They all moved exactly the same way, like copies from the same photograph. I knew what they would do before they did it, because they could only copy what they'd seen me do before. I dodged their attacks, moving in ways they couldn't predict. The silver device in my hand started to hum and grow warm. Somehow, I knew what to do with it. "The park is ours," one of my copies said, its voice echoing strangely. "It has always been ours." "No," I said firmly. "It belongs to everyone. To every hiker who finds peace here. To every ranger who protects it. To every animal that calls it home. And I won't let you take that away." I pointed the device at the first door and pressed the trigger. A beam of pure sunlight shot out, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. The door started to close, and the copies of me began to fade like old photographs. But something was wrong. The door wasn't closing fast enough. The mist was fighting back, trying to stay in our world. My arms shook as I held the device steady, but I could feel myself getting weaker. Then I heard voices, real voices. Memories of the park filled my head. Kids laughing on hiking trails, families taking photos by waterfalls, fellow rangers sharing stories around the campfire. All the moments that made this place special, that made it worth protecting. "You don't understand us at all," one of my copies said as it faded away. "We could have made your world perfect." "It already is perfect," I answered, "because it's real." With one final burst of light, the door slammed shut. The weird colored sky cracked like glass and fell away. The sideways trees straightened themselves out. And suddenly, I was back in the normal mist of the Great Smoky Mountains. Janet and the government team were right where I'd left them, but something was different. The mist was changing. It was still there, but now it was just regular fog, the kind we'd always had in the mountains. "Rich," Janet ran to help me stand up. "What happened in there?" "We won," I said simply, my legs shaking, but not completely. The man in the black suit nodded. "The mist will always be here now, a scar between worlds, but it's just a reminder, not a doorway. They can't come through anymore." We found all 16 people who had disappeared. Just like the journal said, their bodies were perfectly preserved in the mist. We buried them with respect, marking each grave with a small plaque that read, "Guardian of the Mountains." That was 38 years ago. I am still a ranger here, though my hair's gone gray now. The mist still rolls through our valleys every morning, and sometimes, if you look carefully, you might see strange shapes in it. But they're just echoes now, memories of what happened. New rangers sometimes ask me if I am afraid of the mist. I tell them no. I tell them it's a reminder that some places are worth protecting, no matter what. And when hikers comment on how mysterious our fog looks, I just smile and say, That's what makes the Smokies special. But I keep that old journal in my desk, just in case. And every morning, when the mist rolls in, I check my watch, just to make sure it's still ticking forward. My name is Jack Harrison, and I've been a ranger at Redwood National Park for the past 5 years. Before that, I served in Vietnam, something I try not to think about too much these days. The towering redwoods help keep those memories away, most of the time. I am 45 now, with more gray in my beard than I'd like to admit. The other rangers joke that I take my job too seriously, always patrolling deeper into the forest than necessary. But they don't understand. Out here, among these ancient giants, I finally found peace. Or at least, I thought I had, until 3 weeks ago. It started with the markings. I was doing my usual morning patrol, checking the trails after a storm, when I saw them, strange symbols carved deep into the bark of an old redwood. Now, I've seen my share of idiots carving their initials into trees, but this was different. These markings were old, really old. And they weren't random, they formed patterns that made my skin crawl. I took some photos and radioed back to base. That's when Tom Peters, my fellow ranger and closest friend here, told me about the missing hikers. 3 people had vanished in the past 2 weeks. No traces, no bodies, nothing. Just empty campsites, and frightened families asking questions we couldn't answer. "Jack," Tom said over the radio, his voice scratchy with static. "Tahir is someone here you should meet, an elder from the local tribe. Says he needs to talk to you about the forest." I headed back to the ranger station, my boots crunching on pine needles. The sun was setting behind the massive redwoods, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me like fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from between the trees. The elder's name was Joseph Running Bear, and he was waiting for me on the station's wooden porch. His weathered face held the kind of wisdom that comes from generations of stories passed down. But there was something else in his eyes. Fear. "The marks you found," he said without introduction, "they're warnings. Our people have known about the tall ones for centuries. They guard something in this forest, something ancient, something hungry." I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but Vietnam taught me that sometimes the craziest stories hold the most truth. Besides, how could I ignore him when we had 3 missing persons and those bizarre markings? The next day, I found the backpacks. They were torn apart, scattered across a small clearing like something had played catch with them. Inside one, I found a camera. The final photos made my blood run cold. Blurry images of something impossibly tall moving between the trees, its eyes reflecting the camera flash like green fire. That night, as I sat in my cabin reviewing the park's historical records, I discovered something that turned my unease into real fear. Every 22 years, like clockwork, people disappeared in these woods. The pattern stretched back to the park's founding in the 1920s, and probably even further. The sun was setting again, and the shadows were growing longer. But this time, I was sure, they were moving in ways shadows shouldn't move. And somewhere in the darkness, something was watching me with ancient, hungry eyes. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would test not just my courage, but my sanity. A nightmare that would force me to face both the horrors lurking in these woods and the ones I'd brought back from Vietnam. And in the end, I would have to make a choice that would haunt these forests forever. The next morning, I found the footprints. They were nothing like I'd ever seen before. Each one was nearly 2 feet long, with 6 toes spread wide like roots. I took measurements and photos, trying to convince myself there must be a normal explanation. But deep down, I knew better. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest. The morning fog hung between the redwoods like a thick blanket, making it hard to see more than 50 feet ahead. That's when I heard it. Branches cracking somewhere in the mist. Not like a deer or a bear. Whatever was moving out there was big, and it was walking on 2 legs. I froze, my hand touching the radio at my belt. Years of training in Vietnam kicked in, telling me to stay perfectly still. Through the fog, I saw something that shouldn't exist. A figure, tall as a small house, moving between the trees. Its skin was the color of bark, and its eyes. Its eyes glowed like green fireflies in the mist. The thing hadn't seen me yet. I watched as it seemed to melt into the shadows of a massive redwood, like water soaking into sand. 1 second it was there, the next, gone. I'd never seen anything like it, but I knew this had to be one of the tall ones the elder had warned me about. I radioed Tom right away. "You need to see this," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Bring your camera." Tom arrived an hour later. We were both experienced rangers who'd seen every kind of wildlife these woods had to offer, but nothing could have prepared us for what happened next. We found more tracks, leading to a clearing I'd never noticed before. The air felt different there, heavy, like right before a storm. Tom was taking pictures when we heard it, my voice calling from deeper in the woods. "Tom, Jack, over here, quick!" But I was standing right next to Tom. We looked at each other, our faces going pale. The voice called again, perfect copy of mine, but coming from something that wasn't me. "We need to go," I whispered. "Now." We turned to leave, but they were already there, 3 of them, standing between the trees. 12 feet tall, with long limbs that bent in wrong ways. Their eyes glowed like toxic fire, and their mouths. God, their mouths were full of teeth like broken glass. Tom ran. I ran too, but in different directions. I heard him scream, a sound that turned my blood to ice. By the time I found him, it was too late. What they did to him. I still see it in my nightmares. That night, I sat in my cabin with my old service pistol on the table, reading through every file I could find about the park. The pieces started coming together. The markings, the disappearances, the 22-year cycle. These things weren't just hunting people. They were collecting them for something. I found old cave paintings hidden deep in the park files. They showed the tall ones carrying people to some kind of underground temple. The images showed them performing rituals, preparing for something bigger, something worse. My hands shook as I looked at the last photo. It showed a massive shape sleeping under the oldest redwood in the park, something the tall ones were feeding, something they were trying to wake up. Outside my cabin, shadows moved in ways they shouldn't. The radio crackled with voices of people who'd been missing for weeks. And somewhere in the dark, those green eyes watched, waiting to see what I would do next. I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let them take anyone else. Whatever was sleeping under that ancient redwood had to stay asleep, no matter the cost. But first, I had to find their temple. And as I loaded my pistol with shaking hands, I realized that my time in Vietnam might have prepared me for this more than I'd thought. I spent the next 3 days preparing. The other rangers thought I was crazy when I requested maps of the oldest parts of the forest, but after what happened to Tom, they didn't argue. Some of them had heard the voices too, perfect copies of missing hikers, calling out in the night. That's when something strange started happening. Every time the tall ones were near, my old war feelings would come back. That tingling at the base of my skull, the racing heart, the feeling of danger that had kept me alive in Vietnam. Somehow, my PTSD had become like an early warning system. I found the temple entrance on the 4th day. It was hidden under the roots of the biggest redwood I'd ever seen, a tree so old it might have been there since the dinosaurs. The entrance looked like a cave, but the walls were too smooth to be natural. They were covered in more of those strange markings I'd found on the trees. As I went deeper with my flashlight, I found something that made me sick to my stomach. Old government papers, weathered and yellow. They were dated 1924, talking about tall entities in the forest. The government had known about these things for almost 100 years, but they'd kept it quiet. They'd let people keep coming to the park, kept letting people disappear. That's when I heard the screams. They were coming from deeper underground. Real screams this time, not the tall ones as tricks. I followed the sound through twisting tunnels, my flashlight beam bouncing off walls that seemed to be made of twisted tree roots and old stone. I found 2 more rangers down there, Mike and Sarah. They'd gone missing just yesterday. The tall ones had them in some kind of chamber, getting them ready for something. I didn't know what, but I knew it wasn't good. I tried to help them, I really did. But I was too late. The tall ones. They did things to them I can't even write about. Their screams echoed through those tunnels for what felt like hours. All I could do was hide and listen, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold my gun. But hiding let me learn something important. I overheard the tall ones talking, not in voices they'd stolen, but in their real voices. It sounded like trees creaking in a storm, like rocks grinding together deep underground. They were talking about a ritual, something that had to happen during the lunar eclipse next week. They needed 13 sacrifices. They already had 11. Just 2 more to go, and then whatever was sleeping under that ancient redwood would wake up. Something that made the tall ones look like nothing. Something they called the forest's heart. I found my way back to the surface just as the sun was setting. My flashlight caught something in the dirt, a small metal sign mostly buried. When I dug it up, I felt my blood run cold. It was an old military warning sign from 1924. Area closed, unexplained phenomena, extreme danger. That night, back in my cabin, I spread out all my maps and started making plans. The lunar eclipse was in 3 days. The tall ones needed 2 more people for their ritual. And I was pretty sure I knew who they wanted. The last 2 rangers still actively patrolling the deep forest. Me and James, the new guy who'd replaced Tom. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let them wake up whatever was down there. But to stop them, I'd have to go back into those tunnels, back into the dark where they were strongest. And this time, I'd have to do more than just watch. As I cleaned my gun and packed my supplies, I could hear them outside. They were using Tom's voice now, calling me to come out, trying to sound like my friend. But I knew better. And I knew that in 3 days, either I'd stop their ritual or something terrible would wake up in these woods. The funny thing was, I wasn't afraid anymore. Maybe it was because I'd finally found something worse than my war memories. Or maybe it was because, for the first time since Vietnam, I had a clear mission again. Either way, I knew what I had to do. And I knew it would probably be the last thing I ever did. The night of the lunar eclipse came faster than I wanted. I'd spent the last 3 days setting traps throughout the forest, just like we did in Vietnam. Tripwires, alarm systems made from tin cans, anything that might give me an edge. I also made sure James stayed at the main station, away from the deep forest. At least he'd be safe. I entered the temple just as the moon started to darken. The air felt wrong down there, like all the oxygen was being sucked away. My flashlight showed me the way, but I almost wished it hadn't. The walls were covered in fresh markings, dripping with something I didn't want to think about. That's when I found the survivors. There were 3 of them, still alive, tied up with roots that seemed to move on their own. 2 hikers and a camper who'd gone missing last week. They were being saved for the final ritual. I was cutting them free when I felt that familiar tingling at the base of my skull. My PTSD alarm was going crazy. The tall ones were coming. They emerged from the walls like they were made of shadow, 5 of them, their green eyes filling the tunnel with sickly light. They moved faster than anything that big should be able to move. But I was ready. I triggered the first trap, road flares I'd set up near the ceiling. The tunnel filled with bright red light. The tall ones screamed, a sound like trees being torn apart. They hated bright light. It made it harder for them to do their shadow trick. "Run!" I shouted at the survivors, pointing them toward the exit tunnel I'd marked with glow sticks. "Follow the green lights! Don't stop!" Then the real fight began. I'd rigged the tunnels with everything I had. Flares, tripwires attached to bundles of flashlights, even some old military strobes I'd kept from my war days. Every time the tall ones got close, I'd trigger another bright burst. It hurt them, made them solid, made them slow. But they kept coming. And behind them, something was stirring. The whole temple was shaking. Under the biggest redwood, something ancient was starting to wake up. I could feel it in my bones, a hunger older than humanity, something that had slept here since before the first people walked the earth. If it woke up fully, no one in the forest would survive. That's when I saw the support columns. This whole temple system was held up by ancient tree roots and stone pillars. If they came down, I had just enough bullets left. Just enough flares. But there was no way I could set it all up and get out in time. I thought about Tom, about Mike and Sarah, about all the people these things had killed over the years. Then I thought about what would happen if that ancient thing under the redwood woke up fully. I made my choice. It took 12 minutes to rig everything. The tall ones kept coming, but they were cautious now. They knew I could hurt them. Above ground, I could hear the survivors reaching safety. Good. When everything was ready, I took one last look at my watch. The lunar eclipse was almost over. It was now or never. I fired at the first column, then the second. The tall ones realized what I was doing too late. The temple started to collapse, tons of rock and ancient wood coming down. Their screams shook the earth as the ceiling began to fall. The last thing I saw was those green eyes, fading as the tunnel collapsed. The last thing I felt was the ground shaking as something massive went back to sleep, its hunger unsatisfied. I didn't feel the end when it came. They found the survivors 2 days later, walking out of the forest in a daze. They told stories about moving shadows and green eyes, about a ranger who saved them. Search parties found the collapsed cave system, but they couldn't dig very deep. The whole area was declared unsafe and closed off. The official report blamed everything on an earthquake, just like they'd been blaming things on natural causes for the past 100 years. But the 22-year cycle was broken. The tall ones were gone. Almost all of them anyway. Sometimes, hikers in the deepest parts of the forest still report seeing something moving in the shadows. Something tall, with eyes like green fire. But it's just one now, not many. And it seems more interested in watching than hunting. Maybe it's keeping guard, making sure its ancient master stays asleep, or maybe it's watching over the forest, remembering the night when a damaged man with old war skills chose to die so others could live. Either way, the redwoods keep their secrets, and on dark nights when the moon is full, some say they can still hear my voice out there among the ancient trees, warning people away from the deep forest. But of course, that's probably just the wind. Probably. My name is Frank Miller, and I need to tell you what happened during that winter in the Boundary Waters. It's been months since those dark days, but the memories still freeze my blood more than any Minnesota winter ever could. I am a ranger here, have been for almost 30 years. These lakes and forests are my home, even more so since Sarah passed away 2 years ago. Some folks say I buried myself in work after losing her. Maybe they're right. The wilderness became my escape, my comfort, at least until that winter came. It was early December 1963 when everything started. The lakes had just frozen over, and the first real snow had blanketed everything in white. I was doing my usual patrol, checking on the few brave souls who camp here during winter, when I got the radio call about the first body. I remember that morning clearly. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Ice crystals floated in the air, catching the weak sunlight like tiny diamonds. I'd seen plenty of winter deaths before. Foolish tourists getting lost or falling through thin ice. But this was different. They found Jim Parker, one of our most experienced guides, frozen solid near Basswood Lake. Now, finding frozen bodies in Minnesota winter isn't unusual, but this was wrong in ways I can't explain. His body was frozen from the inside out, like something had turned his blood to ice while his heart was still beating. And the look on his face, pure terror frozen in time. The local Ojibwe elders came to the station that afternoon. I've known many of them for years, respected their knowledge of these lands. But when old Joseph started talking about the Wendigo, I didn't want to believe it. The hunger spirit walks again, he said, his dark eyes full of worry. It wakes when the snow flies, and it feeds on more than flesh. I nodded politely, made my notes, and filed them away. 28 years of ranger work teaches you to trust facts, not folklore. But then I found that journal in our old station records, leather-bound, pages yellow with age, dated 1924. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. It described deaths just like Jim's, all during one terrible winter. The writer, another ranger, disappeared before spring came. That's when the tracks started appearing. I've tracked every animal in these woods, but these. They'd appear in fresh snow, deep and wrong-looking, like whatever made them was walking on two legs but wasn't quite human. They'd start suddenly, as if something dropped from the sky, continue for a few hundred feet, then just stop. No turning around, no veering off. Just stop, in the middle of untouched snow. I told myself there had to be logical explanations. Weather patterns, animal behaviors I hadn't seen before, maybe even pranksters taking advantage of the tragedy. But deep down, in that quiet place where we keep our darkest fears, I knew something wasn't right. And then the visions started. That's when I learned that some truths are better left buried in the snow. But I should tell you about that second body first, because that's when things started getting really strange, and when I began to understand that old Joseph's warnings weren't just stories after all. The second victim was found 3 days later. I was the first one on scene. A young couple camping near Knife Lake had heard screams in the night, but by the time they worked up the courage to check, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Not even the winter birds were making noise. The victim was Lisa Chen, a wildlife photographer who'd been staying at the Cedar Ridge cabin. I knew her. She'd stopped by the ranger station just 2 days before, showing me pictures of wolves she'd spotted. Now she was frozen solid, just like Jim. But what scared me most was her camera. I found it a few feet from her body, somehow still working despite the cold. The last few pictures showed something that made my hands shake. They started normal enough. Snow-covered trees, the sunset over the lake. Then there were 5 pictures taken in quick succession, each one blurrier than the last. But in the final shot, half hidden behind a pine tree, there was a shape. Tall, too tall to be human, with limbs that seemed too long and bent in wrong ways. The image was blurry, but I could make out what looked like antlers and eyes that seemed to glow in the camera flash. I didn't show those pictures to anyone else. Maybe I should have, but something told me not to. Instead, I went back to the station and pulled out that old journal again. This time, I read it cover to cover, staying up all night with cup after cup of coffee getting cold beside me. The journal belonged to Ranger Thomas McCarthy. In the winter of 1924, he wrote about 8 deaths, all frozen like Jim and Lisa. He described seeing things too, shapes in the woods, tracks that made no sense. But what really got to me was when he wrote about hearing his dead son's voice calling him from across the lake. You see, I hadn't told anyone, but the night before finding Lisa, I thought I'd heard Sarah's voice. Just for a moment, carried on the wind, my name, in her soft voice, like she used to call me in from the garden. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief and lonely winters can play tricks on your mind. But now, reading McCarthy's journal, I wasn't so sure anymore. And that's when the snow started falling again, harder than before, and the radio calls started coming in about more missing people. The thing about fear is, it's like thin ice. You know it's dangerous, but sometimes you have no choice but to walk on it anyway. And just like thin ice, you never know which step might be your last. 3 more people went missing that week. The temperature dropped so low that the trees started making weird popping sounds as they froze. But that wasn't what kept me up at night. It was the voices. They were getting stronger. I was checking the Eastern Trail when I heard Sarah again. This time, it wasn't just my name. "Frank, please help me. I am so cold." Her voice came from across Eagle Lake, clear as day. I knew it couldn't be real. Sarah had been gone for 2 years, but my feet started moving before my brain could stop them. The lake stretched out before me, a flat, white plain in the fading daylight. Common sense screamed at me to turn back. No experienced ranger walks onto a lake alone at dusk. But Sarah's voice called again, and this time I saw her. Just a dark shape against the trees on the far shore. But I knew that silhouette like I knew my own reflection. I took 1 step onto the ice, then another. The cold bit through my boots. That's when I noticed something weird. The snow around me was swirling, but there wasn't any wind, and it was getting darker much faster than it should have. "Frank." Sarah's voice was closer now, But something was wrong. It sounded hollow, like someone talking into an empty barrel. I stopped walking. The dark shape by the trees seemed taller than before, much taller. My radio crackled, making me jump. Through the static, I heard Dave, one of my fellow rangers. "Frank, where are you? We found another body, and those tracks again, heading your way." The shape by the trees moved. I saw antlers now, stretching up into the darkening sky. The snow was swirling faster, and the ice under my feet made a sound like someone laughing. That's when I remembered something from McCarthy's journal. Something about the Wendigo using the voices of loved ones to lure people onto the ice. I turned and ran. Behind me, Sarah's voice changed into something else. Something that sounded like winter wind and cracking ice and hunger all mixed together. The snow was so thick now I could barely see, but I kept running. My lungs burned from the cold air, but I didn't stop until I reached the shore. Back at the station, I found Dave waiting with grim news. The latest victim was another ranger, Mark Stevens. He'd been found frozen solid, just like the others. But this time there was something new. Carved into a tree near his body were symbols that old Joseph said were ancient Ojibwe warnings about the Wendigo. That night, I did something I should have done much sooner. I went to talk to old Joseph. Because now I knew the truth. This wasn't just about hunting a killer. This was about surviving something that shouldn't exist, something that was hunting us. And it was using our deepest losses, our greatest pain, against us. What old Joseph told me that night changed everything. But looking back now, I wonder if knowing the truth made things better, or if it just made the horror of what came next even worse. Old Joseph lived in a small cabin near the lake. When I got there, he was sitting by his fireplace, like he'd been waiting for me. The warmth inside felt good after the biting cold, but the look in his eyes made me shiver anyway. "Sit," he said, pointing to a chair. "You've seen it now, haven't you? The spirit that wears your wife's voice?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Long ago," he began, "there was a shaman who broke the most sacred law. During a harsh winter, he ate human flesh to survive. But the eating awakened something dark inside him. He couldn't stop. The more he ate, the hungrier he got. The spirits cursed him, turned him into the first Wendigo." Old Joseph's fire crackled, sending shadows dancing on the walls. "But here is what you need to know, Frank. The Wendigo doesn't just want to kill. It wants to possess. It picks someone with deep pain in their heart, makes them see things, hear things, drives them mad with hunger and cold until they're ready to let it in." My hand started shaking. "It's picked me, hasn't it?" He nodded slowly. "Because of Sarah. Your grief makes you open to it. Every time you hear her voice, every time you see her shape, it's getting closer to taking over. How do we stop it? We?" Old Joseph shook his head. "I am too old. But you still have a chance. Tea here is a ritual. But it's dangerous, and you'll have to face things worse than death." Just then, my radio burst to life. Through heavy static, I heard screaming. Then Dave's voice, "Frank, it's here. At the station. Multiple casualties. Ice everywhere. Need backup." The transmission cut off. Old Joseph and I looked at each other. We both knew what was happening. "I don't have time to learn any ritual," I said, standing up. "My people are dying. Then take this at least." He handed me a small leather pouch, sacred herbs. "And remember, when you hear your wife's voice again, it's not her. No matter what you see, no matter what you feel, it's not her." I took the pouch and headed for the door. Behind me, old Joseph spoke one last time. "And Frank, if you start feeling hungry in a way that food can't fix, shoot yourself. It'll be better than what the Wendigo has planned." I stepped back into the cold night. The wind had picked up and snow was falling harder than ever. As I started my truck, I could have sworn I saw something moving in the trees, something tall and thin, with antlers that scraped the sky. I drove toward the ranger station as fast as I dared on the icy roads. But deep down, I knew I wasn't just driving toward my fellow rangers. I was driving toward my final confrontation with the thing that wore my wife's face. The ranger station came into view through the swirling snow. Something was very wrong. The windows glowed with a strange blue light, and thick ice covered the walls like giant fingers. The temperature gauge in my truck showed -40 degrees, way too cold for this time of year. I grabbed my rifle and old Joseph's pouch, then stepped out into the howling wind. The snow wasn't falling naturally anymore. It spun in circles, like tiny tornadoes. As I got closer to the station, I heard voices inside. Lots of voices, all talking at once. The front door was frozen shut. I had to use my rifle butt to break through the ice. Inside, my breath came out in thick white clouds. Every surface was covered in frost, and icicles hung from the ceiling like teeth. "Dave," I called out. "Anyone here?" That's when I saw them. 3 of my fellow rangers, Dave, Mike, and Susan, standing in the main room. They were completely still, like statues. Their eyes were open but glazed over with a milky white film. "They're still alive," Sarah's voice came from behind me. "For now." I turned slowly. There she was, standing by my desk. She looked just like I remembered. Her brown hair, her kind eyes. Even that blue sweater she loved so much. But something was off. Her feet didn't quite touch the ground. "You are not Sarah," I said, gripping old Joseph's pouch tight. Her smile changed then, growing too wide for a human face. But I wore her well, didn't I? Your pain called to me, Frank. Your grief, your loneliness." The room got colder. Ice crackled across the walls. Sarah's shape started to change, stretching taller and taller. Her skin turned gray and pulled tight across her bones. Antlers burst from her head, scraping the ceiling. "You can still join us." The thing that wasn't Sarah said. Its voice now sounded like breaking ice and howling wind. "Let me in, Frank. Let the cold take you. No more pain, no more grief." I felt it then, a horrible hunger growing in my stomach. A cold that went deeper than flesh. For a moment, I almost said yes, almost let it in. Then I remembered what old Joseph said. I opened the pouch and pulled out the herbs. The Wendigo hissed as I threw them in a circle around myself. The herbs burst into blue flames, and the creature screamed, a sound like winter storms and cracking lakes. "She's gone," I shouted. "Sarah's gone, and you are not her." The Wendigo lunged at me, but couldn't cross the burning herbs. Its claws stretched out, inches from my face. Behind it, I saw my fellow rangers starting to move, ice cracking off their bodies. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because now I knew what I had to do to end this. Old Joseph had told me the Wendigo was once human, a shaman cursed by his own hunger. Maybe that's why it needed our grief, our pain. Maybe deep inside, some small part of it remembered being human. I reached into my pocket and pulled out something I always carried. Sarah's photo. The real Sarah, smiling on our last camping trip together. The Wendigo's eyes fixed on it, and for just a second, I saw confusion cross its terrible face. "You remember, don't you?" I said quietly. "Being human? Feeling something besides hunger?" The creature wavered, its shape flickering like a candle flame. The storm inside the station got worse, papers flying everywhere, windows cracking from the cold. But I kept talking. "Sarah taught me something before she died," I said, taking a step forward. "She said pain means you are still alive, still human, and I'd rather feel this pain forever than become like you." The Wendigo screamed again, but this time it sounded different, almost sad. Ice crystals hung in the air around us like frozen tears. I took another step forward, right to the edge of the burning herbs. "I am not running anymore," I said. "I am not hiding from my grief. That's what you feed on, isn't it? People running from their pain?" The creature lunged at me again, but slower this time. Its claws caught my shoulder, and the cold burned worse than fire. But I didn't stop. I grabbed its arm with my free hand and pressed Sarah's photo against its chest, right where a heart should be. Everything happened at once. The Wendigo's scream shook the whole building. A blast of cold so intense it felt hot knocked me backward. All the windows shattered at once. I saw the creature's shape twist and break apart like smoke in the wind. Then everything went black. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. They told me they found me and the other rangers in the frozen station. Dave, Mike, and Susan survived, but none of them remembered what happened. The doctors said we were lucky to survive the freak storm. That was 2 months ago. Spring is coming now, and the lakes are starting to thaw. But things aren't the same. We never did find all the bodies. 15 people died that winter. The official report blamed it on extreme weather and accidents. Sometimes at night, I still hear strange sounds in the woods. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear voices calling from across the lake. But they don't sound like Sarah anymore. I keep her photo in my pocket, but not because I am hiding from the pain. I keep it to remember what she taught me, that feeling pain means you are alive, that running from it only makes it worse. Old Joseph visits sometimes. He says the Wendigo isn't really gone, just sleeping. Says the curse has to go somewhere. But he also says, as long as we face our pain, instead of running from it, we're stronger than any hunger spirit. I don't know if he's right, but I do know that when I look in the mirror now, my eyes are my own. And even on the coldest nights, I don't feel that strange hunger anymore. At least, not yet. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I've been a ranger for 15 years. Most of that time I spent working in city parks, dealing with lost kids and angry squirrels. But last year, I decided I needed a change, something bigger. So I applied for a transfer to Olympic National Park in Washington State. I had no idea then that this decision would lead me to face things I never thought existed. It all started in the fall of 1991. The leaves were turning golden, and the air had that crisp bite that meant winter was coming. I was still getting used to how quiet everything was out here. In the city, there was always noise, cars honking, people shouting, sirens wailing. But here, sometimes the silence was so deep it felt like a physical thing pressing against my ears. The first weird report came in on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was drinking my coffee and trying to fix the ancient radio in my ranger station when Tom, one of the local farmers, burst through the door. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "I saw something last night," he said, collapsing into the chair across from my desk. "Something big, walking on 2 legs. I thought it was a bear at first, but..." He shook his head. "Bears don't walk like that, and it had a wolf's head, I swear it did." I nodded and wrote it down, trying not to show how crazy I thought it sounded. City folks often got spooked by normal wildlife. I figured Tom had seen a regular wolf in bad lighting. But then more reports started coming in. A hiker claimed she saw 3 massive wolf-like creatures walking upright through the trees. A camping couple swore they heard howls that sounded almost like words. And then the animals started dying. The first one was a cow from the Miller's farm. We found it in pieces, but not like any animal attack I'd ever seen. The cuts were too clean, almost surgical. And stranger still, parts of it were missing, not eaten, just gone. Like someone had deliberately removed them. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of cult thing, or poachers using new methods. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The way the other animals in the area were acting, they seemed terrified. Even the birds had gone quiet. Then came the morning I found the body. I was doing my regular patrol along the Eastern Trail when I spotted something strange near the tree line. At first, I thought it was a dead bear, but as I got closer, my heart nearly stopped. It was a man, or at least it had been. Parts of him still looked human, but other parts. The hands were halfway between fingers and claws. The jaw was stretched out, filled with teeth that didn't belong in a human mouth. And the skin, in patches, thick gray fur was growing through. I radioed it in with shaking hands, trying to keep my voice steady. But how do you report something like this? How do you explain finding someone who looks like they were turning into a wolf when they died? That was when the howling started. It came from all around me, deep and purposeful. And in that moment, standing there in the morning mist with that half-transformed body at my feet, I realized this was just the beginning. Something was out there in my park. something intelligent, something organized, and it was watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump, the wind in the trees, branches scratching against my cabin window, even the creaking of the old wooden floors. I kept thinking about that body in the woods, about how human and not human it had looked. The next morning, Sarah Chen, my fellow ranger, called on the radio. Her voice was tight with fear. "Marcus, you need to see this. North Fence, Section 8. And bring your camera." When I got there, my stomach dropped. The 10-foot chain-link fence was bent outward, like something had methodically pulled it apart. But that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was the patterns. They had pulled it apart in exactly the same way every few feet, like they were testing how strong it was. Like they were thinking, "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing at the ground. There were paw prints in the mud, but they were weird. Some looked like wolf tracks, but others looked like a mix between wolf paws and human footprints. And they were organized in a line, like soldiers walking in formation. Over the next few days, we started noticing more strange things. The creatures, we started calling them dogmen, weren't just attacking randomly. They were taking out our cameras first, then our motion sensors. They were cutting off specific trails, herding people away from certain areas. One evening, I was in my tower when I heard it, howling like I'd never heard before. It wasn't just noise. It had patterns, like they were talking to each other. One would howl, then another would answer from miles away, then another. They were coordinating something. I started mapping the attacks, putting red pins on a big map in my office. It wasn't random. They were going after specific places, specific people. Anyone who got too close to the old military bunkers in the north section ended up having accidents or disappearing. Then came the eyes. I was doing a night patrol when I saw them, yellow eyes in the darkness, watching me. The fear that hit me wasn't normal. It was like someone had reached into my brain and flipped a switch marked terror. My legs wouldn't move. I couldn't even radio for help. All I could do was stand there, shaking, as three massive shapes emerged from the trees. They walked on two legs, easily 7 feet tall. Their faces were like wolves, but their eyes were intelligent. They looked at me like they were reading my thoughts. One of them tilted its head, and I swear it smiled. That's when Sarah's voice crackled over my radio, breaking the spell. The creatures melted back into the darkness, but not before one of them made a sound that could have been a laugh. The next morning, we found messages scratched into trees near every ranger station. Not random claw marks, actual words. They read, "Remember 1952. Something was very wrong in Olympic National Park. These weren't just animals. They were hunting us, testing us. And worst of all, they were trying to tell us something. I just didn't know if I wanted to hear what it was. The date scratched into the trees, 1952, kept bugging me. I spent a whole night digging through old files in the ranger station's basement, sneezing from all the dust. That's when I found it. A locked metal box marked classified, shoved behind some old filing cabinets. It took me 2 hours to pick the lock. Something I learned in my city ranger days, don't ask why. Inside were yellowed papers and faded photographs that made my blood run cold. In 1952, the military had a secret program here in Olympic National Park. They were trying to make better soldiers by mixing human and wolf DNA. But something went wrong. The test subjects got too smart, too strong. They escaped into the woods. The military covered it all up, told everyone it was just a forest fire that burned down the lab, but the creatures survived. And now, 40 years later, they were back. Not for revenge, at least not just revenge. They were hunting down the grandchildren of the scientists who made them. That's why certain people were being targeted. I was still processing this when Sarah burst into my office. Her hands were shaking as she rolled up her sleeve. There were weird gray patches on her skin, and when she spoke, I could see her teeth were sharper. "It's happening to more of us," she whispered. "Jenkins and Rodriguez, too. We can hear them in our heads sometimes. They're calling us." That's when the power went out. Through my window, I could see dark shapes moving in the parking lot. Lots of them. And among them were people. Rangers, hikers, locals, all walking like they were in a trance. Their eyes were glowing yellow in the darkness. I grabbed my radio to call for help, but all I got was static and a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been words. The creatures had been planning this for decades, making their pack bigger, learning to control human minds. And now they had us surrounded. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were starting to change color, but she was fighting it. "The old bunker," she said through gritted teeth. "Underground. It's still there from the original lab. Might have answers. Might have a cure." I nodded, trying not to show how scared I was. Outside, more shapes were gathering. I could hear howling, not just from the woods, but from some of the people too. We had to get to that bunker, but between us and it were dozens of transformed people and the original pack, and the sun was setting. The longest night of my life was about to begin. Sarah and I made a run for it through the back door. The cold air hit us like a slap in the face. We could hear growls and footsteps all around us in the dark. "The bunker's half a mile north," Sarah whispered. Her voice was getting rougher, more growly. "Past the old creek." We stuck to the shadows, moving as quietly as we could. Every few steps, we'd freeze as something moved nearby. The worst part was seeing people we knew walking around with glowing eyes, sniffing the air like animals. We were almost at the creek when we heard it, a deep voice that sounded partly human and partly like a wolf's growl. "Welcome, Ranger Rodriguez." The biggest dogman I'd ever seen stepped out from behind a tree. He stood 8 feet tall, with gray-black fur and eyes that glowed like amber. But the really scary part? He was wearing the torn remains of an old military uniform. "You are the first one," he said, showing teeth that could tear through steel. "The first test subject." "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They made us," he growled. "Made us into monsters. And now we're making them like us. All of them. It's only fair." Sarah doubled over beside me, groaning. The patches of gray fur were spreading across her skin faster now. The alpha dogman smiled. "Your friend is joining us. Soon, you will too. The change is in the air you breathe, in the water. You can't stop it." That's when I remembered something from the old files. Something about an emergency protocol. A fail-safe. I grabbed Sarah's arm and ran straight for the bunker door hidden under years of moss and dirt. The alpha howled, and suddenly, we were being chased by dozens of half-transformed people and full dogmen. The old keypad still worked, thank God. We tumbled inside just as they reached us. Sarah helped me slam the heavy door shut. The bunker was full of old equipment covered in dust. And there, on a far wall, was a big red button behind a glass case. The label above it was faded but readable. "Sonic Pulse, emergency use only. It disrupts their DNA," Sarah said through sharp teeth. "Reverses the change. That's what they're afraid of. I can feel it in my head." The door was starting to bend inward. Outside, the alpha was roaring in rage. I broke the glass and hit the button. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It went right through my bones. All around us, we could hear screaming, human screams turning back from howls. When it was over, when we finally got the door open, we found people lying everywhere in the woods, confused but human again. The original pack was gone. They'd run away the moment they realized what was happening. Sarah was human again too, though she said she could still feel something wild inside her, waiting. The others who'd been changing said the same thing. The government showed up the next day in black SUVs. They took all the old files, all the evidence, told everyone it was a mass hallucination caused by gas leaking from the old bunker. Most people wanted to believe that. It was easier than the truth. 18 people died that night. The official report blamed it on animal attacks. They sealed up the bunker and planted trees around it. I still work at Olympic National Park. Sarah does too, though we never talk about what happened. But sometimes, on cold nights when the moon is full, we hear howling in the distance. And it sounds like words. They're still out there, the original pack, waiting, watching, and I know that someday they'll try again. But next time, we'll be ready. My name is Edward Mitchell, and I need to tell you about what happened at Devil's Tower last summer. I've been a park ranger here for 12 years, but nothing in my training or even my earlier work as an anthropologist could have prepared me for what I discovered. You've probably seen Devil's Tower in pictures. It's this huge rock that shoots straight up from the ground like a giant tree stump, standing all alone in the Wyoming countryside. Native Americans have always said this place was special, and now I know why. But let me start from the beginning, before everything went wrong. I am not a young ranger anymore. I turned 48 last spring, but I know every crack and ledge of this tower like the back of my hand. At least, I thought I did. It's funny how you can look at something every day for years and still miss what's right in front of you. Maybe if I hadn't been so sure of myself, if I hadn't pushed to explore those caves, but I am getting ahead of myself. The whole thing started on a regular Tuesday morning in June. I was doing my usual walk around the base of the tower, checking for any trash left by visitors or signs of people trying to climb without permits. The sun was just coming up, painting the tower's rocky face in shades of orange and gold. That's when I saw them, the footprints. Now, I've seen all kinds of tracks in my time here: deer, bears, cougars, you name it. But these were different. At first, I thought someone was playing a joke. They looked like human footprints, except each one was bigger than my whole body. And they weren't pressed into the ground like normal tracks. They were carved into the solid rock, as if something incredibly heavy had walked there while the stone was still soft. I remember standing there, my coffee getting cold in my hand, just staring at those impossible tracks. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the last bit of normal I would have for a long time. Sometimes, I wish I could go back to that morning and warn myself about what was coming. But would I have listened? Would anyone have believed what was about to happen? I should tell you that I am not writing this to scare you. I am writing it because people deserve to know the truth about what's out there, about what lives in the ancient places of our world. And maybe, just maybe, this story will help someone else make better choices than I did when they face something they can't explain. After finding those huge footprints, I did what any ranger would do. I took pictures and measurements. Each print was about 15 feet long, with 5 toes, just like a human foot, but gigantic. I also noticed something strange. They seemed to lead right into the solid rock of the tower itself, as if whatever made them had walked straight through stone. I didn't tell anyone at first. How could I? Hey boss, I found tracks from a giant rock monster. Didn't seem like a great way to keep my job. Instead, I started doing research. My background in anthropology finally came in handy as I dug through old Native American stories about the tower. That's when things got really interesting. The local tribes had all kinds of names for Devil's Tower, but one kept showing up in different stories. They called it the mountain that walks. I found drawings, hundreds of years old, showing a massive figure that seemed to be made of stone. The more I looked, the more I found. Every tribe in the area had stories about a giant guardian that protected something hidden in the tower. Then the climbers started going missing. The first one was Jake Peterson, an experienced climber who knew the tower better than most. He went up one morning and never came down. We found his rope still anchored at the top, but no sign of Jake. A week later, it happened again. Sarah Chen, another climber, disappeared halfway up the north face. Her climbing partner swore he only looked away for a second. But the worst part, the symbols. One morning, I came to work and found strange markings carved into the tower's base. They looked ancient, but I knew they hadn't been there the day before. They were deep cuts in the rock, forming patterns I'd never seen before. And they were warm to the touch, like they'd been carved with something hot. That's when I knew I had to explore the caves. Here is a whole system of them running through the tower's base. Most visitors don't even know they're there. I'd been in them plenty of times before, but now they felt different. The air coming from them was warmer than it should have been, and sometimes, when everything was quiet, I could have sworn I heard something moving deep inside the rock. I remember standing at the cave entrance that first day, flashlight in hand, trying to convince myself I was just being silly. But 20 years of being a practical, level-headed ranger couldn't prepare me for what I found in those dark tunnels. And looking back now, I realized that moment was when everything really began to change. The beam of my flashlight bounced off the cave walls as I walked deeper inside. The air got warmer with every step, which wasn't normal. Caves usually stay cool year-round. My footsteps echoed strangely too, like the cave was much bigger than it should have been. Then I found the paintings. They weren't just any cave paintings. These were huge, covering entire walls, and they looked fresh, like they'd been painted yesterday. But that was impossible. The images showed massive figures that seemed to be made of stone, walking among tiny human shapes. And there was something else. The paint itself had a faint glow to it, giving off a soft blue light, even when I turned off my flashlight. I was taking pictures of the paintings when I felt it, a tremor in the ground. At first, I thought it was just a small earthquake. We get those sometimes near the tower. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, coming from deeper in the cave. Each step made the pebbles on the ground jump. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall. The footsteps got closer. In the dim blue glow from the paintings, I saw something move in the darkness ahead. Something big. The cave wall beside me vibrated with each step. Then I saw it, or part of it. A foot, bigger than my truck, made of the same rock as the tower itself. It moved past my hiding spot, so close I could have reached out and touched it. The thing it belonged to was so tall, its head must have touched the cave ceiling 30 feet above. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched as it walked by, its stone skin grinding softly with each movement. It disappeared around a bend in the tunnel, but I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. When I finally got up the nerve to move, my legs were shaking so bad I could barely walk. I made it back to the cave entrance just as the sun was setting. The tower looked different to me now, not just a rock formation, but something alive, something that could wake up and move. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I knew I should tell someone what I'd seen, but who would believe me? And worse, what if they did believe me? What would they do to the tower, to the thing living inside it? I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive stone foot moving past me in the cave. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the creature knew I had seen it, and things were about to get much, much worse. I was right. The next morning, I arrived at work to find 3 police cars in the parking lot. Another climber had gone missing overnight. Tom Richards, one of our local guides. But this time was different. This time, there was a witness. Lisa, Tom's climbing partner, was sitting in the back of an ambulance wrapped in a blanket. Her face was pale, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she told her story. They had been camping on one of the tower's ledges, about halfway up, when she woke up to a strange grinding sound. The rock next to us. It moved, she kept saying. It wasn't rock anymore. It had eyes. These huge eyes that glowed blue like those lights on the bottom of a pool. It reached out and... She couldn't finish the sentence. That was when I knew I had to tell someone. I pulled my boss Randy aside and told him everything. About the footprints, the cave paintings, what I'd seen in the tunnel. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was crazy. Instead, he just listened, his face getting more serious with each word. I've been getting calls, he said finally, from the local tribes. They've been warning us that something's waking up. Within hours, the government showed up. They called themselves a research team, but I knew better. I'd seen enough men with hidden guns and military haircuts to know what they really were. Their leader was Dr. Sarah Cooper, and she wasn't what I expected. She actually listened to me, took my reports seriously. We've seen things like this before, she told me quietly when the others weren't around. Not exactly like this, but similar. There are things in this world that we don't understand yet. They set up camp at the tower's base, filled with computers and strange equipment. But whatever they were looking for, the creature was one step ahead. Every night, we'd hear it moving inside the tower. The ground would shake, and sometimes we'd see parts of the rock face shift, like muscles moving under skin. Then the earthquake started. Small ones at first, just enough to rattle windows. But they got stronger, and they weren't natural. They always happened when someone got too close to certain parts of the tower. It was like the creature was warning us to stay away. One evening, Dr. Cooper's team found something in one of the deeper caves, some kind of ancient structure buried in the rock. That's when everything went from bad to worse. The creature didn't want us finding whatever was down there, and it was done giving warnings. I'll never forget the sound of stone grinding against stone as the entire south face of the tower began to move. We all stood there, frozen, watching as a giant figure pulled itself out of the rock wall. It was like the tower itself was coming alive. And that's when the real horror began. The creature was enormous, at least 30 feet tall. Its body looked like it was made from the same rock as the tower, with glowing blue lines running through it like veins. As it pulled itself completely free from the wall, we could see its face. It had deep-set eyes that glowed with the same blue light as the cave paintings, and its mouth was full of crystal formations that looked like teeth. "Nobody move," Dr. Cooper whispered. We all stood still, barely breathing, as the giant looked down at us. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the military guys panicked. He raised his gun and fired. The bullets just bounced off the creature with tiny sparks, like hitting regular rock. That's when it got angry. The creature slammed its foot into the ground, and the earth split open beneath us. We all ran in different directions as cracks spread across the ground. I saw 2 of the research team members fall into one of the cracks. Their screams still haunt me. "Get to the caves!" I shouted. I knew the tunnel system better than anyone else. If we could just get deep enough inside, Dr. Cooper and 3 others followed me. We ran into the main cave entrance as the creature's footsteps shook the ground behind us. The vibrations were so strong that rocks were falling from the ceiling. That's when we found it. What the creature had been protecting all these years. Deep in the cave system, through a crack opened up by the earthquakes, we saw a chamber that shouldn't have been there. It was perfectly round, with smooth walls covered in the same glowing blue lines we'd seen on the creature. In the center was something that looked like a metal pillar, but it couldn't have been made by human hands. It was too perfect, too strange. "It's some kind of machine," Dr. Cooper said, her voice filled with awe. "This is what it's been guarding." The creature's footsteps were getting closer. I could feel its weight shaking the tunnel with each step. But as I looked at the machine, something clicked in my mind. All those Native American stories, the cave paintings, the way the creature could merge with rock, it wasn't just some monster. It was a guardian, left here long ago to protect something important. I saw symbols on the machine that matched the ones that had appeared on the tower, and somehow I could read them now. They were a warning. The sleeper must not wake. The military was coming. I could hear helicopters outside. We had only minutes to make a choice that would change everything. And that's when I realized what we had to do, even though I knew it would come at a terrible cost. "We have to seal the caves," I said. "All of them. The creature isn't the threat. It's what it's guarding. If the military gets their hands on that machine..." Dr. Cooper nodded. She understood. But we could hear voices echoing through the tunnels now. Soldiers were coming. The creature's footsteps had stopped, which somehow felt even scarier. "The explosives," one of the researchers said. "The ones we brought for rock sampling. They're strong enough to bring down the tunnel entrances." We worked fast, placing the charges at key points while the ground trembled beneath our feet. The creature watched us from the shadows, its blue eyes glowing. It wasn't attacking anymore. Somehow, it knew what we were doing. Then we heard the helicopters getting closer. A voice on a loudspeaker. "This is a restricted area. We are authorized to use force." That's when the creature did something I'll never forget. It placed one giant hand on the cave wall, and those glowing blue lines spread from its fingers across the whole tunnel system. The walls began to hum. It wasn't just a monster made of stone, it was connected to some kind of ancient technology that ran through the whole tower. "Run!" I shouted. "Hit the detonator when I say." We sprinted for the main cave entrance. Behind us, the humming got louder. The creature was doing something to the machine, something big. The air itself felt electric. We made it out just as the military trucks arrived. Soldiers were jumping out, pointing guns at us. Above, the helicopter's spotlights lit up the tower. "Now!" I yelled. Dr. Cooper hit the detonator. The explosions went off one after another, and the cave entrances collapsed. But the creature had its own plan too. The entire tower lit up with those blue lines like glowing veins in the rock. There was a sound like the biggest thunder you've ever heard, and a pulse of blue light shot out in all directions. When it hit us, every electronic device died instantly. The helicopter's engine stopped, and they had to make emergency landings. Every truck, radio, and flashlight went dead. The creature had used the machine to create some kind of energy pulse that killed anything electronic within a mile of the tower. And as the dust settled from our explosions, we saw it merge back into the tower's wall, becoming part of the rock again. In the end, 14 people died that night. The government covered it up, of course. They said it was a rock slide, a tragic accident. They put up new fences and warning signs. Devil's Tower is still there, still drawing tourists who take pictures and don't know what really lives inside. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I go back and look up at the tower. The blue lines are still there if you know where to look, glowing faintly in the dark. The creature is still guarding its secret, and maybe that's for the best. Some things in this world are meant to stay hidden. But I wrote this down because people should know the truth. If you ever visit Devil's Tower and feel like the rock is watching you, well, now you know why. Because it is,